So hi, everyone. I know we're going to have a number of folks trickling in, which is great. We're really excited to be here today. My name is Sydney Stenekes, and I'm here with my colleague, Emma Wallace. And we are with the Rural Development Network. And before we get started, I did just want to take a moment to acknowledge that RDN's physical office is located on Amisquatiswa, which is also known as Beaver Hills House or Edmonton, and we are located on the traditional territories of Treaty 6 and Métis Nation District 9. Although I currently live in Edmonton, I previously lived in Ottawa. Emma, my colleague here, she lives in Ottawa, and so I also think it's really important to recognize the land that we're on today, the Anishinaabe Algonquin, the unceded territory, of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples and nations. And I think it's really important for our team to always take a minute to reaffirm, my personal and our organization's commitment to reconciliation through our homelessness initiatives, as houselessness is disproportionately impacting Indigenous peoples and nations across Turtle Island as a result of colonization. And I'm reminded by Indigenous partners and elders that the term homelessness does not exist in many Indigenous languages. And so together our team is really committed to learning and unlearning as we seek to decolonize the way that data is collected and information is shared, as well as the way that homelessness funding is administered, which we'll talk a little bit about shortly. And we do recognize that this land acknowledgement is one step towards reconciliation, but it does require meaningful, intentional and active reflection through our work. So I know over the course of the next few days, I'm sure a lot of us are going to be thinking about this and thinking about how we can really advance reconciliation in our work. So just a little bit about us quickly in terms of who we are. I'm just curious who in the room here is familiar with our organization. Okay, so a fair amount, that's great. So for those of you who may not know about us, so we are the Rural Development Network. We're a non-for-profit that works with rural communities across Canada, but we do have a lot of our roots in Alberta because we were formerly the Alberta Rural Development Network. And there are a number of ways that we support rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. We create innovative tools and resources and develop trainings. And we do this in partnership and in collaboration with rural communities. We do a lot of capacity building activities and really work or look to empower our rural communities to implement their own community-based initiatives. We also do a lot of advocacy work. We bring folks together across a variety of different events and networks to share information. And then a large part of our role is also supporting smaller communities with accessing funding. We are the Rural and Remote Reaching Home community entity. So the federal government's Reaching Home program. So what that means is they distribute funding to us and we distribute out that funding to rural, remote, First Nations and Métis communities in Alberta. Now, this is, I guess, kind of a summary of some of our key initiatives. I would say our three core initiatives are housing, homelessness, and rural immigration. And so our housing team, they focus more on housing assessments, strategies, funding applications. And then, as I said, we distribute funding out to communities. And then our homelessness team, so Emma and I and our team members, we support with, education, capacity building, coordinated access, and all of that good stuff. And we're really excited to talk more about the Reaching Home program today and a really unique partnership, an exciting partnership that emerged this past year, specifically with Homer Trust Edmonton. Do we have anybody from Homer Trust in the room? I'm just curious. Okay, no one to oh, Linda, good to see you. Perfect, just in the nick of time. Linda used to work for our organization and now works for Homer Trust Edmonton. So yeah, we'll get into that shortly. So we're going to be talking about data today. We're going to be talking about rural-urban partnerships, and we're also going to be talking about how communities in rural Alberta are responding to homelessness. There are a number of our amazing projects in the room here today, so I'll be sure to shout out some of you. But I will first pass things off to Emma to get things started, and great to see you, Elle. Yes. Hello.
Yeah, so just want to talk a little bit. I think it's really important that we're always kind of grounding any conversations we have, whether it's about partnerships data in the definitions of homelessness. So kind of a little bit of context here. We probably all know this, but I think it's important to say is rural homelessness looks different than urban homelessness. We often see Oh, maybe that'll help. There's a bunch of wires. I can't go much closer here.
Can we put it down here? And then
Okay, how is that? Close? Okay, perfect. So in rural areas, we see more of what we would traditionally call like hidden homelessness. So folks who are maybe couch surfing, stay in cars, kind of shuffling in and out of the spectrum of homelessness. In comparison, what we often see in urban centers, including somewhere like Ottawa, we're kind of in the main square here where you see a lot of unsheltered homelessness and a lot of emergency sheltered experiences. So that kind of is something that I always like to frame, as we do kind of see different experiences of homelessness throughout urban and rural areas. So what I want to talk about here first is just like how we would define homelessness. So we would define it kind of according to like a spectrum of unsheltered, emergency sheltered, provisionally accommodated. So that's folks who are maybe couch surfing, who are in temporary situations, transitional housing, anything like that. And then folks who are at risk. So maybe they are one rent payment behind, for example, or they've recently lost their job, or they're spending more than a third of their income on housing. And so if they were to lose a job, that would put them in a really precarious situation. This also includes folks who are experiencing violence or in unsafe situations. So I think it's important to flag these because folks can move in and out of this spectrum on a regular basis, and how people experience homelessness really impacts how we work with them and what that means in a community. One thing I want to flag here is what Sydney said in our land acknowledgement, which is traditionally we've used the word or the language homelessness, but that's not a word that like super resonates with everyone. And so recently we've seen a bit of a shift in language, moving more towards that houselessness language to kind of reflect or better reflect the experiences felt by our kind of Indigenous community members. At the same time, we have a really hard time using the language of houselessness when we're talking to municipalities and government officials, because the idea of houselessness means you don't have a house. Like, that's a direct translation in their minds. But we've talked about, when we're sharing data on homelessness or houselessness, we're talking about an entire spectrum, which includes folks who might have a roof over their head. So we've kind of shifted to use more of the language of like housing insecurity to reflect the entire spectrum, as well as the experiences of Indigenous folks with houselessness. So I kind of shift a little bit in that language throughout today, and Sydney will as well, but I just kind of wanted to give that overview of kind of our understanding and our kind of shift in language over the past couple of years. So when we're talking about housing insecurity, the stats we heard today in our opening plenary on housing insecurity, all of that really highlights the urban experience of housing insecurity. So the kind of national standard to enumerate or to measure housing insecurity in this country is a point-in-time count, which is done often in urban centers. It's done over a 24-hour period where people will go out into the community and ask anyone they see outside what their experience with homelessness is, and they'll fill out a bit of a survey. And that's often supplemented with shelter counts. What we find often is that that methodology isn't like a great fit for a lot of rural communities, and many rural communities don't have shelters to use data to supplement. So the rural experience is kind of vastly undercounted and not really included in the data that we're hearing on what homelessness is. So we had a bunch of communities, more rural communities, come to us about 5-6 years ago now, asking for help on how they can measure housing insecurity in their area, using a methodology that maybe best fits their needs. So we developed, in partnership with the communities, the government, and academics, what we call the step-by-step guide to estimating rural, remote, and Indigenous homelessness to support them in this. It's very similar to the point-in-time count in that we're enumerating a snapshot in time. We're using very similar questions in our survey. But what we use is, we call it a service-based population estimation approach. And I always say that's a ridiculously long name. But what it really means is we partner with service providers across a community, and that can be anyone from like a library, if you do have a shelter or a drop-in center, employment and income services, doctor's offices, pharmacies. It could be a restaurant if you have like a hub in the community. And they promote and administer surveys with community members over the course of usually a 30-day period. And we find this just kind of fits the rural context a little bit better. It allows service providers to reach more people who would be considered that hidden homelessness, and it relies a little bit less on that volunteer aspect to be actually going out and walking across the community, especially when we think about rural, remote, and Indigenous communities being kind of like vastly geographic in range. So in that, like in the last 6 years, we've worked with over 75 communities to do that. And one thing that we've done recently is Alberta provincial estimation, where we worked with 45 communities across Alberta. This was just last fall, about this time actually last fall, to enumerate homelessness in their area. So we wanted to get a snapshot of what that looks like across Alberta and see if we can find some kind of provincial data that we can then use. So what I want to do here, before Cindy brings us into kind of the partnership and solutions-based conversation, is share a little bit about what we know about rural homelessness in Alberta. So based on the 2023 estimation, we know that there were 2,429 survey respondents who were housing insecure, and they shared living accommodations with 2,354 dependents under the age of 18 and 2,537 additional adults. So, based on these survey results across 45 communities, there were at least 7,320 community members experiencing some form of housing insecurity at the time of the survey. And this means, again, across that entire spectrum. So that's not 7,000 people who are unsheltered or 7,000 people who are only at risk. It really does range across that spectrum. And the top 3 reasons for housing insecurity were low wages, an inability to afford rent or mortgage, and increasing rent costs. We did this survey in 2020 as well, with some of the same communities and some different communities. And only one of the top 3 reasons was income related or like cost related. So what we're seeing, and this isn't necessarily surprising, we're in the midst of a housing crisis and a cost of living crisis, is a big shift to okay, I gotta stop using my hands, I'm so sorry. We're seeing a big shift now to income being directly tied to your ability to stay safely housed. So this is what I was talking about in terms of experiences across the spectrum of homelessness. We saw the majority of folks experiencing some sort of at-risk of homelessness, but lots of people were provisionally accommodated. 244 were emergency sheltered, which is a low number because there just are no shelters in the area, or in most of the areas that we were working with. And then 151 folks were unsheltered. Some demographic trends I think are really important to highlight here. They're not unfortunately surprising, and they're also quite devastating, but I do think it can be helpful in contextualizing all this. So 91% of Indigenous respondents were housing insecure. 97% of respondents who spent time in care were housing insecure, so part of the foster care system in some way. And then 81% of housing insecure respondents who spent time in care were Indigenous. 93% of queer respondents were housing insecure. 88% of folks who were born outside of the country were housing insecure. 89% of veterans or active serving members were housing insecure. So we're seeing a lot, like a huge trend here in terms of like vulnerable populations really struggling in rural areas with housing insecurity in some way. The other thing I want to highlight here, and I think it speaks back to our reasons for housing insecurity, one of the things that I hear the most in my job is just go get a job, like that'll solve all your problems. And I think it's really important here to highlight that 69% of housing insecure respondents had employment in some way, that whether that was part-time employment, seasonal employment, or full-time employment. So the reality is having a job isn't actually enough right now. We're in the midst of a housing and cost of living crisis. Like, having a job isn't enough. A lot of folks are underemployed or underpaid for their work and are really struggling. So despite 69% of housing insecure respondents being employed in some capacity, 49% reported an annual income of less than $50,000. And then the other thing I want to highlight here before I pass things back over to Sydney is around emergency shelter use. So like I mentioned, not many of our rural communities have the capacity to hold a shelter. The ones that do have phenomenal shelters, but many of them don't have a shelter in any way. So 13% of our respondents accessed emergency shelter at least once in the year prior to filling out the survey. And then 5% reported like stays in transitional housing. But I think the important number here is that 24%, so 581 respondents experiencing housing insecurity, did not access emergency shelter when they needed one. And the main reason for that is because there was none available to them. And then the second reason was, if they were able to get one, it was full. And we just heard, it mirroring kind of like our urban stats, we just heard this morning that, shelter capacities are at 150 and 500 times the kind of capacity rates right now. And so that's not entirely surprising that we're seeing the same mirroring happening in rural areas. But yeah, so that's kind of a bit of an overview of what we know right now. We're going to be doing another provincial estimation actually in the fall of next year with, again, probably a lot of the same communities, potentially a couple new ones who are interested in joining. But that's our most recent kind of Alberta rural data. And I'll pass it back over to Cindy to share a little bit about how we've used this data in some of our work now.
Thanks, Emma. And I better click. So to start off, I'm just going to be providing a little bit of kind of context around how funding works essentially in Alberta, because I think the context is important. And so essentially we are, the Rural Remote C for Reaching Home. We get about $4 million, or we got $4 million to distribute over a 2-year period essentially from the federal government. And just this past February when we had launched this past February when we had launched our call for proposals, we received an overwhelming 77 applications with requests totaling over $22 million. So we were oversubscribed by $18 million. And I've been doing this job for just over 4 years now. And when we first started off, we were getting maybe applications from 25 communities. So not only is this showing the increasing need, but it's, I think, also showing the increasing number of communities who are looking to respond to homelessness in smaller communities, specifically in Alberta. And what's unique about Alberta is that there are 7 major cities. So essentially these 7 cities, they receive funding from the province, like homelessness, operational funding. They also receive Reaching Home funding. But only a couple years ago did the province really start to look at investing in some rural winter shelter beds. However, there are only a select number of communities receiving this funding, and there is no year-round like homelessness operational funding that rural communities can apply and access. So we're constantly advocating for increased funding at all government levels. But yeah, it's certainly not sufficient to respond to the need that we're seeing. And what we always like to say too, and what's unique about Alberta, is that there's approximately 25 to 30% of the population living outside of these 7 major cities. And I'm sure for the folks in the room here, whether you're coming from an urban or rural background, that there's migration, from rural to urban, from urban to rural. We're hearing anecdotally, kind of both of those scenarios, and we can maybe get into a little bit of a discussion later today about it. But it impacts what's going on. We've heard it. We just did some community visits a couple weeks ago, and what we heard from them was what is going on in the cities directly impacts, what's going on in their smaller rural communities, and vice versa as well. So I think, it's just really kind of important to like highlight that piece, because I think it is really kind of unique about Alberta, and then that will kind of, feed into the conversation around the really unique partnership that developed. The one other thing that I do want to say, because it is really important for our team, and it has been an important commitment over the last couple of years, is we worked with Linda, who's in the room here, really closely on this. But we really wanted to reduce the barriers for Indigenous nations and Indigenous-led organizations in accessing Reaching Home funding. The federal government is moving towards more like distinction-based funding streams, but as of right now, we are the community entity that delivers that funding. And we don't believe that Indigenous communities should have to be competing with rural municipalities and vice versa for funding and it's such limited funding, as you can see, right? We ultimately made the decision with our regional advisory board for the Reaching Home funding to distribute the funding across as many communities as possible. So we are funding about 46 projects of those 77 applications. Some people say we're crazy. Administratively, it's challenging, but given everything that we've discussed, everything that Emma's discussed, I think it is the right approach to take, and it's been really incredible to see just how creative, rural communities are with limited funds, but that's not to say that they don't deserve more, and they certainly do, and we're trying to advocate for that. But sorry, I know I'm kind of jumping around, but one more thing I just wanted to highlight was that in order to reduce those barriers, we needed to change the way that we were administering the funding, the way we were doing applications, the way we were having projects report back on funding. And so we worked closely with our Indigenous liaison, Elle, who's absolutely wonderful. He's been a huge part of our organization's reconciliation journey. And we also got feedback from Indigenous partners, and past projects. And we ultimately decided to implement a letter of intent process and an oral application process for the past couple of years. And as well, when projects, are asked to report back to the federal government, the reporting can be quite onerous. So we've really tried to reduce that as much as possible and just allow for more culturally appropriate reporting methods, allow projects to do their reports orally and really kind of walk alongside them throughout the process, because it is it's overwhelming, for our team, but when, communities are having to respond to really important crises and have other priorities, paperwork is not the number one priority, right? So with all that being said, when I first started with this organization, we had very few Indigenous communities even applying for the funding. It was a very onerous application process, and for the next couple of years, we are funding 10 Indigenous-led projects, which, there's still a long way to go in terms of advocacy, but it's definitely a positive step forward. So given the need, now we've talked a lot about the need, Emma's talked about the data that really supports the need, we really recognized over the last couple of years that we needed to do some more formal advocacy as a team. And so what we did, and I'm going to kind of walk through the process a little bit, just in case it's helpful for those of you who are engaged in advocacy work, because truthfully, there's been a lot of learnings along the way. Happy to answer any questions. We are by no means experts. We're still learning. But this was a really unexpected partnership that came about in a really kind of unique way. And so to give just a little bit of background again, for those of you who might be, more involved in the funding side of things, you might recall that it was last Christmas, essentially, that it was right before holidays, I remember, because I saw the news announcement and I was feeling quite, defeated. But the federal government had announced, and sorry, I shouldn't say that. It was great that funding was going to other communities. It just wasn't coming to rural. But the federal government had announced that $100 million was being invested through Reaching Home to specifically support communities in responding to winter and sheltered homelessness. And that funding was going to the cities. We had asked, could rural be able to access that funding? And they said just due to the parameters and stuff that, we wouldn't be able to. But we've over the years developed some really strong relationships with some program officers within, previously it was Infrastructure Canada, now it's HICC. And we put in essentially a formal request for additional funding. And how we did that was we essentially went back to current projects that we had at the time. We had asked them to fill out a really brief, I don't even want to say application, but a really brief kind of form, just basically asking what is the need in a few sentences, and what would you be looking for funding for to specifically support winter responses to homelessness in their communities. And we also were having an influx of new communities, reaching out to us asking for additional funding. So we kind of compiled all of those formal requests together, put it in a letter, and for some of you who are involved in advocacy, I know we're often, told go to the minister level, right, and try and build those relationships with the folks higher up in government. And I do think that is an important part of it. But in this case, it was the relationships, truthfully, that our team had developed with the program officers in Infrastructure Canada and their team of managers and senior leadership, like that request got escalated up pretty quickly. And that's how we were eventually, when I say eventually, it took a few months, but we were connected with Homer Trust in Edmonton, which they are the community entity for Reaching Home for Edmonton. And so what had happened essentially is they had received some of this funding. They had it available, they had some funding available, and they really recognized, the connection and importance of supporting smaller communities outside of their city, and their board voted to give our organization some of that funding. It was $500,000 to distribute out to rural, remote, and Indigenous communities this past winter. And I know that sounds like a small amount of money, but that money had a huge impact. And what we heard from the service providers and the projects that were able to access that funding was, it came at a really, crucial and important time, and it just gave them that boost. We know there's so much burnout across the sector, and sometimes just getting a little, a small but big win like that can go a long way for morale and just give you that extra boost of energy to keep you going. So that was kind of the funding side of things in terms of the partnership. I'm going to talk a little bit about where that funding went and how it was utilized. But what was really great, and I think important to emphasize about this partnership, is that this led to new opportunities to kind of get our foot in the door with the 7 cities. For those of you who may not be familiar with Alberta, there's a 7 cities forum essentially hosted every year, which brings together, service providers and, key stakeholders working in the homelessness sector across the province to talk about how to coordinate, better align funding priorities, resources, all of those things, and how to essentially address and respond to homelessness across the province. And because of this partnership, Susan McGee, the CEO of Homer Trust Edmonton, invited our team to come and present at the 7 Cities Forum. We thought, maybe there won't be as much interest in our presentation because we're the only kind of rural one. And boy, were we wrong. So many urban service providers took an interest and wanted to learn more about the work that, our organization and other communities were doing to respond to homelessness. And we're really engaged in wanting to have further conversations about how can we better work together, urban, rural, to discuss, data. How can we better track migration patterns? Because there really is limited information and data currently available. So this opportunity opened up a lot of doors for us to, start to have more conversations with some of the urban service providers across the province. So, what started off as something, or just kind of advocacy, something truthfully, and with advocacy work, you don't always know what the outcome is going to be, right? And it can be really defeating. You try, and you're not always successful. This was, like I said, a pretty big win for our team that we wanted to celebrate and kind of share with you today. And we're really interested, and I know we're going to kind of engage in a bit of a discussion later on, but really interested to hear from you all, what urban-rural partnerships might exist in your community, or just what you've found effective too in terms of advocacy, because I think advocacy can look different in every community, and you might have different approaches. So 22 communities received this funding, and thank you. Perfect. Sorry. So 22 communities received this funding. And in addition to the Homer Trust Reaching Home funding that we got, we also, of course, we had the $4 million over the next couple of years going towards supporting communities. And these are just kind of a number of ways that rural communities right now in Alberta are responding to homelessness. So we have a number of communities who are developing MAP programs, shelters. We have a few of them here in the room today. You might be familiar or have heard of the shelter pods model that originally emerged out of Edson, Alberta. Drayton Valley also adopted a similar model, and they're actually going to be presenting this afternoon at the Rural and Remote Stream. So if you're interested in learning more about their project, definitely attend this afternoon session. I think Lola Strand and Mayor Nancy Dodds are going to be presenting about how the municipality was really supportive of this project. We've also had a community in the Bow Valley adopt what they call is a Safe Park program. So essentially employees of the Bow Valley can utilize this program so that they can park their vehicle and have a safe safe place to sleep at night and access to like washrooms and facilities. I know that's been one that's of particular interest, and we haven't heard of a lot of similar municipal run programs like that. So yeah, curious to hear if you're familiar with others. We have a number of rural communities who are housing temporarily, folks in hotels or motels, although we are hearing more and more from communities that their hotels are completely full in their communities. Now hotels are being looked at as more longer term options because there is no housing. And so that definitely complicates things when it comes to using, hotels for emergency responses in some of these smaller communities. We have a number of communities, doing basic needs, providing basic needs services and providing outreach services. Thanks to the Homer Trust Reaching Home funding that we received, there was a community, Peace River, that was able to pilot a mobile response outreach program. We're seeing more and more communities, of course, implement, eviction prevention programming, as well as housing supports. And then, community and mental health navigation supports and culturally appropriate supports. The list goes on. Like it's been pretty incredible over the last 4 years to see what responses and solutions communities are coming up with. And kudos to those of you in the room who are some of those community leaders initiating those projects. It's incredible to see. So now we're just going to share, and unfortunately we can't share all of the projects that we're currently working with, but we thought we'd share kind of a few examples of some unique responses that communities are doing. The first one, Onum Rural Youth Association. So, and I'm sure a lot of rural communities are facing this, but there is really limited resources when it comes to supporting youth experiencing homelessness. And so Onum Rural Youth Association is looking at addressing these gaps. Currently, it's one person doing this job. She travels to meet the youth where they are at. She's largely working across 13 communities in central Alberta. And it's been, incredible to see too the response from the youth and some of the client testimonials that she consistently kind of shares with our team. One of the youth said, "I can talk to you where I couldn't talk to anyone before. You explain things in a way that makes sense." And I think that was really powerful. And specifically Louise, who runs this program, she's really dedicated to providing that free, mobile, trauma-informed crisis intervention and that psychological first aid approach to assisting youth and young adults who are at risk or experiencing homelessness. So we've seen, this. Currently, she's been able to help over 40 youth, and these are specifically 40 youth who are either experiencing or at risk of homelessness, but she's been able to work with even youth beyond that. And this is just one person doing this work, so we're hoping that, she's looking to, I think, expand and grow this program, but it's been operating now for a few years. And then these are just some examples. So I had mentioned Drayton Valley earlier and their Shelter Pods program. So definitely, check out their session later this afternoon to learn more about their project. We also are currently working with Strathmore Overnight Shelter. They're based in Strathmore, Alberta. They're currently providing 20 shelter beds, and they are one of the only pet-friendly shelters in Alberta. So really cool. They've actually said they get calls from surrounding cities, including Calgary, on pretty much a daily basis, asking if there's room to support folks from the urban centers. So, and what's really unique about Strathmore in particular is they're doing a lot more than providing shelter services, which of course are critical. But just this past quarter alone, they've been able to house 11 individuals. They're really focused on providing the long-term, those housing supports and navigation and all those types of things. And Strathmore is operated by a volunteer-run board, which is, I just met them actually a couple weeks ago for the first time. We've been working together for 4 years, and it was incredible, to meet all the dedicated volunteers who have been supporting this initiative, and they're looking to expand their beds and operate 24/7 this coming winter. And then Mountain Rose Women's Shelter Association, they're in the room here actually. We got Shelly at the back and Jack. Jack's the housing support coordinator. Nice. Oh, we got Janice. Nice to see you. Sorry, stuck in there. So they're definitely the experts on their program, but the reason why I wanted to highlight the work that they're doing is because they are a women's shelter, and of course, traditionally their mandate is to serve women and children who are fleeing domestic violence, but they saw a need in the community. It was like back in 2014. Their executive director, Cindy, is also at the conference, somewhere probably not in this room. And they saw a need to assist folks beyond, who are also experiencing homelessness in the community. And so, they've been operating their housing supports program now. Yes, it's been essentially a decade. And I think you're getting close to like 1,000 people now that you've assisted through this program, and they've really developed and built really strong relationships with landlords in the community and surrounding communities. And Jack, who's here today, I'm sure could speak to the project a lot better than I can. But just kudos to you folks and the work that you've done to, you saw a need, and I know, sometimes you're constrained. Oh, do you have a question?
No, I just have to say that we wouldn't be here without your organization and Cindy collaborating, because that created a job for the housing that made our organization more aware of what else is needed under one roof. So it's all about the collaboration where it's brought us to.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shelley. And you've been your whole team has been a phenomenal partner to work with over the years. And it was our previous CEO who had really, I think, started and built that strong relationship. And so, it's been a pleasure. And then just finally, lastly, and we're gonna just wrap up here. And again, we can't highlight all the amazing projects going on, but this is another project, transitional housing project, specifically in Lac La Biche County. They just opened their doors this past January, I believe. Right now they have 10 shelter beds that are operated by Lakeland out of the Elle Shelter Society. And they, there's a multi-stage kind of approach to this project, and they will eventually be opening transitional housing beds. But this project takes place on municipal-owned property. We've started to see it takes time for these kind of supportive housing projects to develop in rural communities, but we've started to see, a couple more of them over the last couple of years, which is really, really exciting. So that's, and the one thing too, I just want to highlight as we kind of wrap up here is a lot of these projects were, started or initiated because of data that essentially emerged from the completing, a housing and service needs estimation, or, just gathering data. Data obviously is really important in terms of when it comes time to access funding. So it's, it's honestly, I could talk about, and sorry, I realize I've definitely gone over, but I could talk about these projects for a really long time. But thanks to all of you who are in the room doing this amazing work, and happy to take any questions, and looking forward to discussing, to engaging in a bit of a discussion. So thank you.
Did you have a slide deck as well? Sorry? Do you have a slide deck as well? Okay. I don't know what to do with this thing. Oh, it's already there we go. It's already gone. It's all good. It's all good.
So in an attempt to try to salvage the rest of this session, we actually had a cancellation to presenters. So what I was actually hoping to do is facilitate a bit of a conversation with folks about urban-rural partnerships. And so I wear a couple of hats. I was chair of the National Alliance to End Rural Homelessness, which was really just a committee of folks, agencies, individuals across the country who wanted to advocate for supports in rural communities. I also wear a second hat, though, and I've been the chair of the board of a nonprofit in Lanark County called Cornerstone Landing. I'm now getting to pass that hat over to Elle, who's our new manager. But my story is probably not different than a lot of other folks in the room, in the sense that I'm a volunteer. I've been volunteering for 25 years, never been paid a penny to do this work because we had no money. And so, and when we did, I wanted to hire Elle anyway, so we could have a full-time person doing that work. But the reason I'm standing here and the reason Cornerstone even exists is because the only solution we had to homelessness, and I know there's a person with lived experience in the room too who could actually speak very directly to this, but I'm not going to point them out. If they want to speak, they can. But in Lanark County, the only solution we had to homelessness for young people was to put them on a bus and drop them in the nearest city, with no connections, no supports, no discussion about how to support them there. Shelters were they're not, as you know, not like hotels. You can't just book a room. So lots of these young people became stranded on the streets of Lanark County. And so, I think consistently we could all speak to this issue. There's consistent issues around transportation back and forth, and, lack of housing in rural communities and lack of funding for rural communities. And so So part of what I wanted to do today was to hopefully get some feedback from you folks as well, because we're really trying to have a conversation about how better to coordinate services and support folks moving back and forth between rural and remote communities. So anybody who's familiar with the Reaching Home National Housing Strategy knows that there's 5 streams. There's designated communities, which tends to be communities of a population of 30,000 plus. They tend to get 5-year funding. There's funding for data collection. There's funding for coordinated access. And then there's the Indigenous stream of funding, and which I already mentioned, drastically underfunded, and hopefully, always advocating for more for that, because even in Leonard County, we need Indigenous-led programs. We don't have any for housing programs. So, and then there's the territorial stream, and then there's the rural remote. What am I missing? I'm missing one. Designated communities, rural road, territorial. Quebec actually has a stream as well. Yeah. So what we find with the rural remote stream, though, is it often rolls out in 1 year or 2 year. Are you guys doing 1 year?
Well, we
do
too,
too?
yeah.
Oh, good for you. So you used to do 4, yeah. So a lot of the rural remote funding rolls out in 1 year streams, and so it's really hard to build organizations and support folks when you only have 1 year funding. And every year we get asked in Ontario, what's your sustainability plan? We're like, we have none. If you pull the funding, we will close our programs. That's what will happen. So there is no plan. So, advocating for increased resources there is really important too. And then how you actually build housing in small communities. I was approached by a mayor of a community in Ontario with a population of 900 people, and they've got 1 or 2 homeless people that they have no idea how to support or what to do in terms of housing, right? So these conversations are conversations that are happening right across the country, we know. I've been having them for, 25 years that I've been doing this work. So I'm hoping to share. There are some folks in the room. Mike Lethby was going to speak today, he canceled. He had a conflict with another presentation. If you don't know Mike, he's got an incredible story if you could ever hear him talk, because he started working in the Niagara region with a shelter, and the shelter went up in beds to 30 beds. And then he recognized that so many folks coming into the shelter were from surrounding rural communities that he started providing supports in those rural communities instead of in the urban center, and he's now back down from 30 beds in the shelter to 6. So there are some really great stories out there, but as you probably know as well, that communicating to rural communities is really difficult as well. So because when I came to this conference 10 years ago when it started, I've been here every year, a lot of the conversation was urban, and it still is. I'm always teasing my urban colleagues going, stop using the word city every time you talk about homelessness, because we have it in our small communities too, right? So I keep saying I'm hoping we're going to have a discussion here. So this is the discussion part, and I'm hoping Sydney and Emma are going to help too. So I'm hoping to pick your brains. I'm hoping you guys will introduce yourselves and share your stories too if you have anything to share. Obviously, we're concerned about data. I was just looking up Yellowknife's numbers. Yellowknife, Holly Ferris was actually, I don't know, is Holly in the room by any chance? No? So Holly was involved with the National Alliance too. She worked in Yellowknife at the time actually, and she talked about their migration numbers there. And 90% of people counted as homeless in the city of Yellowknife are actually from surrounding areas. And again, that's a story that's consistent across a lot of communities. So we also know when it comes to data, Rebecca Schiff and Ashley Wilkinson did a research project as well called Counting the Undercounted, and found that a lot of rural and northern communities have 1 to 5 times higher prevalence of homelessness than the largest cities in Canada. And so again, we don't talk about this enough, and we don't fund it enough. And the rural road stream, just to quote some staff from the federal government over the last few years, I heard repeatedly them say, if you don't qualify for Indigenous funding, if you don't qualify as a designated community, if you don't qualify for Quebec or territorial, apply to rural. So in other words, it's just a leftover catch-all phrase, or pot of money, and it's drastically underfunded to begin with. So I have invited some friends to share ideas as well, because I know I'm putting you all on the spot by saying please share your stories, but we have Sheldon Pollett here. Sheldon, if you don't know Sheldon, he was with Choices for Youth in Newfoundland, and same sort of thing. I've gotten to know Sheldon because we've been having these same conversations about how in Newfoundland and St. John's, a large portion of the young people come from across the province into the city to access shelters and housing services. And so we've been having this conversation for years. Katie's here from the Ottawa Alliance. So we've been talking for years as well about how we better support people who get moved. I say shipped, but I say that not out of disrespect to the individuals, but out of the way we treat people in terms of shipping them off to cities and dropping them off there and not supporting them adequately or appropriately. So Katie and I have been having this discussion about how do we better coordinate services amongst rural and urban communities. And because rural communities don't get funded to do the work, we kind of have to rely on our urban partners to say, yes, please, let's have this conversation. So when it comes to coordinated access. So Katie's here too. And where's Jen Crow? Jen's back here. Jen's actually taken over Sheldon's job. She's at Choices for Youth. Yeah, and Sheldon's at Raising the Roof. So these folks can actually share their work as well in terms of how they're supporting rural communities too. I don't know if you guys want to chat now for a few minutes, do you? Jen, do you want to talk about Choices?
Sure, yeah. And thanks so much for the amazing presentation. I was like taking pictures and writing lots of notes. So myself and previously Sheldon as well with Choices for Youth in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. And one of the things, like so much of what you're saying, Terry Lee, and you folks as well, in your experience in Alberta in particular, resonates with me because we noticed several years ago that about 20 to 25% of the young people who were coming through our doors at Choices for Youth had recently arrived in the city. And so it kind of prompted this provincial research that we did to really understand, like, why is this happening? And our organization is really focused on ending youth homelessness and supporting the most vulnerable youth. So we know when they're coming through our door, it's not because, it's not because they want to, it's because they need to. And when we started to dig into that research, we learned really two things. Young people across our province told us that A, they're coming because the services that they need just don't exist in their communities. And the second thing that we heard is that they may exist in their communities, but to your earlier point, Terry, like they can't access the services. So they may be, and the service may exist an hour down the road in their region, but if they don't have a car and there's no public transportation, how would they access those services? So where that led us is really this kind of community-led approach. We've engaged over 1,000 young people, 300 plus service providers, 32 communities across our province. And it led to this provincial model of integrated youth services, which I'm sure many of you folks are familiar with. There's incredible models of integrated youth services across this country, from Foundry in BC to Youth Homelessness Ontario in Ontario, to Everbelt in Quebec. But really this model around like what happens if you create a single point of entry for a young person who's navigating homelessness, but also maybe navigating mental health challenges, maybe aspiring a primary care provider, may be experiencing family breakdown, may need a hot meal. And that's really the model that we're now creating. So again, we started in St. John's. We have integrated youth services in there. It's a really amazing model. A young person can come through our doors, they can get a hot meal every single day. While they're eating their hot meal, they can wait to see our physician just 10 steps away from where they're eating. They can have a conversation with the physician, and with the consent of that young person, that physician may pull in a housing support worker. And so all of a sudden they're having this conversation around what's the symptom you're experiencing, but also how do we make sure that we can create stability in your life through long-term supportive and affordable housing. So that model now, we are now hoping to open 2 more integrated youth services hubs operating that same suite of wraparound services in 2 more rural communities this year. And then our goal is 9 integrated hubs across Newfoundland and Labrador. But I think so much of this, and I want to ask you folks after as well around, like, how do you look at this from a provincial model, and how do you really analyze the size and scope of rural and of homelessness in a province? Because I think part of it is we still don't have enough information, right? So even to be able to say, okay, these are the communities that require the most support, it's really hard for us to analyze that in a way that makes sense. And I think all we know right now is that folks are coming into our urban centers, and overwhelmingly when you have a conversation with them around, like, is this where you want to be? Like, tell us about your experience. They say, like, I don't want to be here, right? Like, it's not because I'm coming to the city because it's like fun and sexy. It's I'm coming because I don't have a choice. And often when they arrive in our city, it's a really unpleasant experience for them because their family natural supports aren't there. They don't know their way around. And if they come through our doors, we're lucky. We're lucky if they come through our doors. But for the many young people who don't come through our doors, unfortunately, often the path is to become street entrenched or in and out of the shelter system. And unfortunately, their quality of life decreases. It doesn't increase when they move into the city. So our goal, again, so much to what you folks are saying, our goal is not to do better at supporting those young people in the city. It's to reverse that trend. So if we're seeing 25% of the youth who we're supporting just arriving in the city, We want to see that number go down because they're getting services and supports closer to home, because that's where they want to be. And we know that if they can stay, if they have the choice to stay closer to home, their outcomes, their experience in their life is going to be better.
Absolutely.
So that's a little bit about what's happening in our province. But Sheldon has a much larger history on this than I do, so I'm not going to pretend to take credit for this work.
No. So thank you. I'm here because what happened is no clearly for the years. I'm currently with Raising the Roof. So one of the things I'm discovering, been there since June. Most people know Raising the Roof to advocacy, public awareness. What I'm very much aware now is the fact that since 2020, people are not aware that Raising the Roof has made a major pivot as an organization at a critical time in the country, which is we are now in the business of owning, developing, and operating affordable housing. We want to do this at a national scale. Most of the projects we've launched to date have been in Ontario. In the middle of November, we're opening our first units in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which we're really excited about. We've got a second project there already in the books, a multi-unit building that we bought that we want to convert into affordable housing for people coming off coordinated access lists in Winnipeg as well. But also going to Atlantic Canada, which is where my home is, and working with communities there as well. The segue into this conversation, because thank you for the credit, Jen, it is a team effort. Jen speaks to this as eloquently as I ever have, so I'll leave that. Where Raising the Roof fits into this equation is one of the first things I did when I arrived was attend something called the Atlantic Mayors Congress in PEI. I think all the mayors, obviously there's a couple of big cities there, but primarily mayors of small communities throughout Atlantic Canada. So at a municipal level, all saying the same thing. They are seeing a tremendous, it was always there, it is exponentially grown over the last couple of years, just like everything else from a housing perspective. Two things: capacity from a technical skills perspective, capacity from we've got a part-time clerk in our office. There's no way they can take on the huge challenge of developing housing. Even if you are successful from a small community accessing resources, it's just not there. The other issues are capacity around, sometimes in small communities, you might have a group of really passionate volunteers, but often the structure of a nonprofit doesn't exist sometimes in these areas as well. So our response, if we can develop housing for ourselves, we are now working with a number of groups and agencies across the country to lend our development management experience so that actually we can triple, quadruple, hopefully in the years to come, our impact. Because even if we believe in our mission and mandate, we've got a great team, there's only so many housing units we have that we're going to build over the next 10 years. Our vision is, but if we, in addition to those units, support others, then we can really hit what we need to hit in this country around the number of affordable housing units. The other key piece of our work as well is looking at, and I know this from my time on the board of CHRA years ago, or recently in conversation with Ray Sullivan at CHRA, the sad news is year over year for the last 20 years probably, there's a net loss in affordable housing. So for all the money we've spent building, developing, trying to respond to homelessness, trying to build housing, every year we lose more housing to this day than we create. So there's the harsh reality of what's going on in our country, and that certainly has accelerated over the last number of years as well. So part of our work is to work with communities as well around how do you retain the existing affordable housing so that begin even take a prevention-based approach to that, is so that we begin slowing down the number of people who are ending up in housing stability and losing their housing, and unfortunately run the risk of becoming homeless, but securing and maintaining the housing stock that we already have. So that's a big part of our work as well. Ottawa Community Land Trusts are active on that front. One of the sessions not a session because we just cheated and had our own meeting on the side, is exploring the launch of a national community bond for affordable housing. Not sure what that might look like, but we're going to initiate the conversation. What we'd like to see happen is that approach wouldn't just be for our development of units. So if we're partnering with Choices View to build affordable housing, how do we bring that to bear for our partners as well? So a lot of aspirational forward thinking, but part of it is because we know in rural and remote communities in particular, not just the big cities, we need all the innovative tools we can muster to respond if we're going to at least try to get ahead of what seems to be a very unfortunate trend in the country.
Thanks. Out of curiosity, who is working or living in a rural, remote, or northern community in the room? Great, okay. So happy to see this many attendees from small communities because it wasn't like this years ago. So, so it's really important that this conversation is happening. That's great. Is anybody in those rural, remote, northern communities a housing provider? Like, do you actually have housing that you're providing? Okay. Wow, such a small amount, huh, compared to the. What about having some sort of data collection system to track folks? Yeah.
So we had we did a pit count.
Okay.
Disaster.
Mm.
So it then
Yeah.
moved to our municipal government, and we don't have any homelessness.
Mhm.
It's a disaster. So I'm very interested in learning more about your success with related to the information.
Yeah, let's chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else using a data system of some sort?
The point in time data in Alberta this year, there's no other,
Yeah. So the point in time count is connected to urban cities. Katie, you can probably talk about this. You folks do one in Ottawa, yes? Yeah, so the designated communities would do point in time counts. And what we've heard from feedback from rural communities is they often get missed in that because often there's an urban center for a municipality and it's a municipal wide approach that they're supposed to be doing that, but how you support, and you folks are experts in this area. So, and you know, I think all communities have struggled with that. We've heard over and over that pit counts are a disaster, quote unquote.
They're also, yeah, the piece to this that speaks again to that funding is urban centers are funded to do a pit count is the other piece of this, and rural communities are not funded to do that. It's not necessarily a lot, but there is a little bit of funding put towards urban centers to do point-in-time counts. So rural communities also struggle with that aspect of they're expected to do it, but don't have the funding to do that either.
I can be useful now.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, please join us.
So Tara-Lee was like, "You're joining this." I'm happy.
Yes.
So one thing that's interesting is we have been chatting for years about how we actually make that connection between urban and rural. And I do think we're finally, Mike Lethby is not here, but we hired him for a local shelter project on diversion, and we're finally going to start getting data on where people are coming from. So understanding how tight are those things. In Ottawa, that yellow piece is actually our city. That is the shape of our city.
Yeah.
We are, by land, the biggest municipality in Canada. There's like, I don't know, several European countries shoved together is the size of Ottawa. So we're really weird in that we have a core in a downtown, but so much of our community is rural. It took me an hour to get to, well, if you're from Toronto, that may not too long, but like 75 kilometers to get to one of our counselors' offices. And there's one bus that goes there. And so what we found is that actually, interestingly, we're also a hub for newcomers and asylum seekers. And so we've had a lot of folks find housing on the outskirts because it was more affordable. Then the winter would come and they'd have to pay energy bills. And that was like the second that people then became homeless and came back into the shelter system. But I think the challenge that we're operating in as a designated community is also a data vacuum on where people are coming from. And I don't think there's a ton of will yet to really, how do we help people reconnect with their community if that's what they want to do? So we're hoping that this diversion project is actually going to lead to some work on that. I'm now going to go totally left because Sheldon brought it up. But another thing that I think could be very, very useful for rural communities is land trusts. So we just started one up in the last 2 years. And basically in a land trust, it's amalgamating your assets. So we have 40 co-ops in Ottawa. Each of those is a $10 million building. Join them, you've got $400 million of capital to start to work with, of equity. And I wonder if there's a real opportunity with rural communities, because we all know the cost of building is so pricey, but actually starting to amalgamate assets through a provincial or rural, I don't know what that looks like, but a land trust that is essentially leveraging what you individually have to start to be able to build at a more aggressive pace. That was very left field, and I don't know if all of you want to go there, but it's your call.
Is anybody here using HIFIS? Okay, I see some smiles in the crowd. I'm not sure what people's thoughts on HIFIS are too, but I've seen some smiles and laughing, but yep.
So we're a living center, we offer basic needs and medications, which are great options. People that we're serving who are on too robust in terms of our desire to be people that live and there's two questions, two things that need to
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, housing, homeless information, individual, thank you. Thank you.
developed by the SDC.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So Elle and Katie, we've had this conversation too, because we've been through an interesting process with Cornerstone in Leonard County, again, a little agency that supports youth homelessness, but Elle reached out to see if we could get onto HIFIS because we have no case management system, so our staff are mobile and they're running around with paper files everywhere, which is like terrible these days. We shouldn't need to do that with client information, right? Like, so we're always terrified something's going to go wrong with that. So looking for some sort of system makes sense to tie into something, even though we've heard terrible things about it. That at least it's functioning, it's going to provide some client confidentiality. But we essentially, Ottawa said no. We were told actually we should onboard with Ottawa because they're our closest designated community. And they said no, we're not onboarding people now. So, and pretty much Kingston I think was the same. And so we were stuck with like essentially being told by the federal government as well, no, we're not giving you a license, so you can't use HIFIS. So again, another big difference in terms of how rural communities and urban centers are being treated. It's a very different process and different funding. So anyway, so we're looking at, we know there's projects out there and like pilot projects where people have managed to get a HIFIS license, but yeah.
Question actually,
Yeah.
and perhaps I'm not sure who was speaking about using HIFIS. Are you a small community?
Yeah, like Picture County. The thing that's kind of skewed in our way, we're continuing to use that over the development system to work for the ones that to process. It's really, we need to know approximately how this is all of those things come back in the continual education development. So getting some like who to do it in that probably take us about 6 weeks. But that is the practice today. So that's how it stands for us. All of those things we need to understand there. In terms of understanding why what the circumstance is too complex. Right.
Sorry, is it okay if I ask another quick question? The reason I ask is I'm coming from the Boat Valley in Alberta. So I'm the executive director of the Homelessness Society in the Boat Valley. We run an emergency shelter program, and it's low barrier. So,
Well,
I already
right. No barrier.
Yeah.
So, you tend to, you make important concept. Many people who are dealing with that vulnerabilities and what we're talking about are making important to show up. And it really, to meet that in a whole bunch of sort of stuff, it stands in the way to the developing relationship, to the knowing what all the layers are. Because it's inappropriate for them to do that and make it down to
Yeah, that would be a concern for me during that. And just for clarity,
if you're a shelter, because I've worked with private shelters, it's a little bit different than when you're in average service that it is responding.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we were looking into HIFIS, so that's why I'm just curious and interested in learning more. I was told that HIFIS is set up through a municipality. Is that correct, or how do you access HIFIS?
So it's changed quite a bit in the last 2 years, right? So we used to have we have a local organization in Scotia that manages homelessness. And so the training used to be at a very local and agency cluster, and now somewhere like completely different. So you're not familiar with it. There's always enough training, right? And about 6 months getting used to that system. And it used to be that it was simple text. And you're in then an hour, and now you're into the queue, which can take a bit of time. Is it centralized on the training? I'm sure it makes sense for that, but from a user perspective, it takes so much longer to get your answers to your questions, which is really hard. You can go on doing something. So for our organization, half of our team uses HIFIS, the other half feeds the other half of the team their HIFIS information, because it will take far too long for me to get them on with it, and we as an organization are looking at simpler things.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate your feedback. It's very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, and the second piece is information. So my question about,
Sydney Nema? Yep.
you mentioned about a couple of proposals where you had some kind of like hurdle, for a better word, enticing indigenous communities.
Yes.
I'm just curious to know what the strategies or whatever magic you did in order for them to be enticed. I know it's a tedious process regardless whether you're an indigenous or non-indigenous, but I'm just curious. My second piece of information about HIFIS. I'm from Lethby. I work for an indigenous organization and we use HIFIS. And how our HIFIS is structured, we are in a shared environment. So all our agencies are in a shared environment that in which they can see some information, not the case notes, of the people that we serve, so we can coordinate our responses. We're also working on a pilot project to move HIFIS provincially with Winnipeg, Thompson, and Brandon. So that's where we're at right now. I understand the hurdle about the different types of services that fits, with the service program. We use admissions for our shelters because we have 4 emergency shelters, like large and smaller shelters, like transitional warming centers and drop-ins and stuff like that. And we use also for like housing, like all those reaching home activities. Reaching home, we kind of use HIFIS for a variety of programs. So if you have some questions, I can provide you with some insights.
Good. I'm going to reach out to you. I'm going to reach out to you. We're tossed around the idea of doing a province-wide or a national HIFIS for rural communities actually as a pilot project. So I'm going to start bugging people about it. So touch base. So I said I wouldn't put them on the spot, but I'm going to. Do you want to share some thoughts on this? Okay. We should always center our work around lived experience. Do you want to come up? Yeah.
I do have a pretty loud voice, but I'll use the microphone just in case. Hi everyone, my name is Atlas Commanda, and I work for the Alliance to End Homelessness Ottawa, one of the great organizations that put this on. And I also work with Terry Lee at the Rural Homelessness Youth Network. And I just heard a lot of conversations today about, youth experiencing rural homelessness and urban homelessness, and kind of about their experiences, what they might be feeling. And I just kind of wanted to chip in as someone who was a youth who experienced homelessness, just to bring in that lived experience just for a couple of minutes. Because in this conference, it's important to me to keep lived experience, in the room, in the conversation. I know there's a lot of service providers here that might really want to hear from that perspective. And so I just wanted to chime in. I can't speak for all youth, but I can chime in with my own experience. So one of my first roles in the field actually was for a youth and Indigenous advocacy position for One Call, One Click, which is an Ontario-wide mental health and addictions coordination system. And the first thing I told them was to access services for a youth who lives rurally, it is absolutely double or triple as hard for any youth that's living in the city. We cannot access anything. There's next to nothing. And for an Indigenous youth, 5 times that. So that's the first thing I told them, is we have access to almost nothing, which makes it very difficult. That was my experience, that I simply felt that I had to run to the city to access services I needed, both for my mental health, both for physical health, and for housing. So I came to the city by myself at 17. And my first night in Ottawa was at a youth young women's shelter, because that was what I needed to do to get started in the city. And as Tara Lee said, there's a lot of youth that will do that and would prefer to be would prefer to return home. For some cases that works. In my case, it wasn't, right? I didn't necessarily want to go home because that wasn't safe for me, and there would have been, so diversion wouldn't have worked in my case, but that's not to say that diversion and prevention couldn't have been very, very useful. I wished that there was more prevention. While I was in my town that I was living in, I lived in Renfrew, which is only an hour away from the city. And I could not access counseling before I hit crisis. So for about probably 5 years, from 17 when I got into the city, was constantly accessing emergency crisis services. Ooh, now I'm doing it. I also talk with my hands. So I was constantly accessing emergency services because no one listened to me when I needed preventative help. And I did ask for help, right? Like many people. So yeah, that was kind of just my experiences, that I wished I could get help before when I asked for it, when I needed it in my home. But those options weren't there. So I had to come to the urban centers and get the absolute crisis services. So a lot of steps could have been taken on that journey before we got to that point. And now actually I'm going back to work on my home reserve, to work on services there, to bring more remote services and resources that we desperately need. But that's 10 years later. So that's kind of the timeline, that sometimes it's going to take 10 years to get us back. And now that I'm part of the Rural Youth Network and working in homelessness, I'm constantly learning about services that even exist in Renfrew, the same town that I grew up in, and I didn't know about them. So it's not even necessarily that there weren't services, it's that I wasn't told about them even when I needed them, and I wasn't in crisis youth at the time. So the service providers, community, did not know about the services, or possibly they were overused and they were full and weren't accessible to me for that reason. So yeah, those are just some of the things that I wanted to pitch in on, and say that a lot of times when the youth get here, they are absolutely in crisis. And there was just a lot of more preventative things. I think transportation is a huge one. I'm gonna leave you on that note. Sounds like a small thing, but it's not. I didn't have a driver's license and I couldn't get anywhere. So even small things like that, right? How do we get places? That was a huge barrier for me. So I just wanted to commend everyone here. It was a great presentation, and I'm super happy to see all the work being done, and just wanted to chime in really quickly with that lived experience piece to give a voice to that. So miigwech, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Alice. I think that's really, it kind of helps ground again, as we share stats, like to hear that kind of personal piece to it. And I'll just kind of echo a lot of what you said, specifically kind of two pieces around first transportation. So one thing we didn't share is the number one reason that people noted they couldn't access services in the 2023 estimation was because of a lack of transportation. Most rural areas don't have any sort of public transportation. A lot of folks don't have cars, can't afford it, et cetera. Huge barrier. A lot of communities are trying to do really good work around like car share programs and whatnot, but we're not there yet. So definitely a flag around barriers to service. The other thing I want to share is around, accessing services. I think you highlighted the two kind of biggest things. The services often don't exist. When they do exist, they're not widely known, or they're oversubscribed, so people can't access them. The other thing that comes up a lot is, a lot of I work with communities anywhere from like 200 people to 80,000 people. And when you get into those smaller communities, 10,000, 5,000, 3,000, like your neighbor could be the person who provides those services. And so are you, like a lot of folks aren't necessarily comfortable, even if the services are available, sharing what's going on with them, because then everyone's going to know. And so I think that's another thing that's kind of like a bit of a barrier in rural areas. And so that's where we see a lot of migration happening. People will go into urban centers to access services and then come back to their rural area where they'll stay and where the support systems are, so that they're maintaining privacy in that. So I think that's another piece of that migration that we see a lot in our area anyway. Yeah.
Just we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I was going to just answer your question. Sorry. I know. We're covering a lot. We're covering HIFIS. We're covering affordable housing. Yeah, it's... No, thank you for your question. And yeah, happy to chat more afterwards as well. But in terms of kind of the steps that we took, I'll be honest, it wasn't necessarily just like, one or two steps. It's been, and we're still learning as we go. Like I said, there's still a lot of work to be done. But the first thing that our organization did was we hired an Indigenous liaison, because the funding that we receive that actually goes out to Indigenous communities, it's not part of the Indigenous funding stream for Reaching Home. That funding is designated for urban Indigenous organizations. And so we recognized as, a non-Indigenous organization that was the first step that we needed to take in order to, make sure that there was an Indigenous lens when it came to reviewing the applications. And so, Emile, our Indigenous liaison, we've been working with him for a few years, and he's been, like I said, instrumental to our team's reconciliation journey and understanding that, oral tradition is really important, and having folks complete an onerous application isn't going to necessarily give you all the details and the information that you might need in order to recommend a project for funding. So that was kind of the first step, and obviously building relationships with nations and Métis settlements, specifically in Alberta. That's very much ongoing. It takes time. It takes time to build that trust, and we've heard loud and clear at some of the information sessions we've hosted through the call for proposals. That was kind of another piece that we did from our Indigenous. We had Indigenous specific information sessions, and what we heard loud and clear was that folks were frustrated, and we had a lot of attendees at these information sessions, but they were frustrated that they were having to compete with rural municipalities and compete with, municipalities who might have hired, grant writers to do these funding applications. And so the more engagement that we did with Indigenous partners, then that's how we essentially adapted that application process. And we've heard of other community entities across the country doing a similar approach, like having a letter of intent and oral application process. And I think, I think we're seeing more folks kind of moving in that direction. But it takes time, and just having that relational approach, and even after a project like an Indigenous project is successful in receiving funding, continuing to build that relationship, supporting with capacity building, recognizing, like, it's been a huge learning, and it's something that we talk about as a team, like recognizing that they folks might miss a deadline, but what's going on in their community is, they're having to deal with a lot more important things, right, than the paperwork that we need. So I think just, ongoing learning on our team as a non-Indigenous person myself has been really important. But really interested in kind of, hearing more about the work that you're doing, but that's just a little bit of kind of what some of the steps we've taken.
We good? Thank you for sticking around. I really appreciate it. I was afraid half the room was going to get up and leave when we went to this informal process. So hope you enjoy the conference, everyone. Take care.
I guess about the song.